necessary trade. Amar and I affirmed the resolution resolved in response to the current crisis, a government should prioritize the humanitarian needs of refugees over its national interests. Contention 1 is smuggling. Millions of refugees have used illegal and life-threatening smugglers to escape their home country. Michael Birnbaum of the Washington Post in September explains that the journey of refugees is made by foot, rail, and bus. And over the more than 1,000 miles between, smugglers are almost always involved in at least part of the journey. Anna Shea of Amnesty International explains in June that the people smuggling promotion program created by governments is from their national interests. Governments say that smugglers or traffickers are the problem, but in reality, smuggling and trafficking are the result. Inadequate government action is the chief cause. When people are desperate, nothing will stop them from leaving. Governments bear responsibility for preventing them from using safe and legal channels, thereby forcing them to use the services of smugglers. However, Francois Capote of the UN in October explains, if states urgently adopt a new approach to migration that places the rights of refugees at the forefront, new legal channels for migration would create possibilities for refugees to securely reach safe destinations. Otherwise, the number of migrants risking their lives on dangerously overcrowded vessels over perilous routes can only increase. That's why Michael Diedring, Secretary General for the European Council of Refugees, declared in April, we could put smugglers out of business immediately if the EU would create legal channels for refugees to reach Europe. The impact is twofold. First, it decreases funding into terrorist organizations. Adrian Blundell-Wignall of the OECD explains in October, illicit money flows from human smuggling may be used to finance terrorist activity. Terrorist groups are increasingly turning to organized crime, including human trafficking and smuggling, as a source of funding. Second, it ends the deprivation of life, liberty, and property from refugees. Orlando Crowdcroft of the International Business Times reports in April, refugees who have survived the harrowing journey with smugglers tell horror stories, with widespread reports of refugees being sexually assaulted, ransomed, and often sold into slavery. The economics of smuggling is the callous driver that explains most behavior linked to the deaths of migrants. When the boats and trucks are overfilled, when food and water is not provided, when passengers are jettisoned into shoreline waters, money is behind the mistreatment. In fact, Adrian Blundell-Wignall calculates the destructive costs smugglers impose on refugees. On average, he finds smugglers' fees amounted to 262% of a household's annual income. Furthermore, an analysis by the International Organization for Migration finds in April, as many as 70% of the deaths it records refer to migrants who are missing, usually at sea, due to smuggling. Contention 2, international cooperation. International cooperation or multilateralism increases when governments prioritize humanitarian needs, tackling the crisis. The Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation explains in 2012, in the face of today's humanitarian needs, global solutions need to be provided by the international community. Bilateral actions alone cannot prevent or relieve the consequences of conflict. As a direct consequence of the growth in global humanitarian challenges, recent years have seen an increased need for multilateral humanitarian action. Prioritizing the humanitarian needs of refugees begins the path of cooperation. Gil Loschler of Oxford's Refugee Studies Center in 1993 explains, governments rarely act in isolation when developing refugee policies. Rather, they generally act to actions taken by other governments. The generosity of Western nations can be a powerful incentive in getting other countries to act humanely, but conversely, the withdrawal of this generosity can be quite devastating. The sole impact is solving the crisis. Loschler again explains, improving collaborative actions on the refugee issue provides for a more action-oriented system, developing quick and effective reaction to ethnic conflicts and refugee problems. Historically, Charlotte Alford of the Huffington Post explains in September, in order to end the crisis of millions of Vietnamese refugees fleeing their home country in the late 1970s, the key was international cooperation, recognizing that refugee protection is a shared global responsibility. Meraz Beg of the Huffington Post in September explains, in response to the crisis in Syria, if more countries opt in and assist with the refugee crisis, the burden is lessened on everyone as a whole. So far, Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and Egypt have hosted the most number of refugees out of Syria, a total of 95%. A lack of cohesion means the crisis will continue to worsen. For any solution to work among European countries, they must work together. Ultimately, Kamal Kirsti of the Brookings Institution of October explains that cooperative deals in Europe between Germany and Turkey help address the biggest issue, solving the root cause of the Syrian refugee crisis. For those reasons, Amar and I are proud to support.
Everyone ready? We negate. Contention 1 is false choice. Government should never choose non-citizens over citizens for 3 reasons. First is the social contract. Giving citizens give up rights, laws, and obligations to the state with the expectation they receive priority in return. Governments cannot function when the very system that binds them together is undermined. Second is the constraints of sovereignty. If a government doesn't prioritize its own citizens, no one else will. And third is justifying infeasibility. Affirming justifies governments being able to get involved in all international affairs over the needs of their people with no threshold for what warrants such action. This is politically impractical because it forces governments to infinitely stretch their resources. For example, the US intervenes in crisis when it is in interest but it cannot and should not be expected to do so every single time. Contention 2 is brain drain. Prioritizing humanitarian needs leads to human capital losses. Williamson of the Forced Migration Review explains in 2012 that a driver of displacement in crises is a pull factor, especially in underdeveloped regions where aid provided to refugees exceeds what is available to much of the resident population, and as a result, humanitarian assistance creates an incentive to migrate. When a country sends the message that it cares more about its refugees than its own citizens, migrants will stay. Schluck of the London School of Economics quantifies last month that the number of asylum seekers raises 12% if the welfare provisions for refugees increases by 1%. Colin Dyke of the American Refugee Committee explains in 2005 that high levels of assistance provide a disincentive to repatriate. When given the choice between returning home or staying in camps where needs are provided for, refugees choose to stay. Sustained provisions of free services erode refugee education, as refugees must adapt from a situation of economic dependency to one of self-reliance. The loss of workers precludes long-term growth. The UN Refugee Watch explains this March that the Syrian refugee crisis has accelerated the reversal of human development gains Syria achieved. Its Human Development Index score rolled back by 31%. Hack explains in 1992 that human capital flight generates a permanent reduction in per capita income proportional to the fraction of the population that migrated. Contention 3 is political disenfranchisement. Prioritizing refugees over citizens creates public backlash. Chan Hook of the Center for Crisis Research writes in 2005 that when states violate the social contract and place the well-being of non-citizens over citizens, it generates a level of xenophobia and frustration that governments cannot neutralize, radicalizing the anti-humanitarianism movement. Disgruntled citizens would blame refugees for their political problems, as Francis of the Carnegie Endowment for International Race empirically confirms this September, the Syrian refugee population became a scapegoat for national challenges in Jordan that predated the refugee crisis, effectively creating a buffer for public criticism against the government. This precludes political motivation for future policies. Agata of the Policy Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 2015 writes that negative attitudes towards refugees creates a one-dimensional perception of humanitarianism that makes people less inclined to politically support pro-human rights action later down the road. Francis furthers that negative public sentiment towards Syrians constrained the Jordanian government in its ability to react to the refugee crisis. The government thus responded to increasingly vocal public resentment by limiting its hospitality towards Syrian refugees through restricting the number of Syrians who enter the country, closing accessible borders, and attempting to confine more refugees to underdeveloped camps. In the big picture, Hajnal of UC San Diego writes in 2013 that when large waves of migration leads to radicalized anger, it degrades views on immigration, leading to increasingly conservative policymaking and restrictive immigration reforms. This complacency effect spills over to other countries. Dalamite of Market Watch warns in August that decisions by countries to shut off borders and deny access to asylum would only propagate other EU countries to follow suit. This is because when other nations perceive humanitarian aid as an inevitable failure, they too will take steps to avoid it in the future. A con ballot uniquely avoids legitimizing the belief that refugees are more important to governments than their people, preventing an immense wave of anti-humanitarian action in the years to come. And it is for these reasons that we are very proud to negate.
So, sometime before March rebuttal, can we see from your statement the 1% comparison?
Yeah, sure.
And then also the desire to repatriate.
Oh, it goes down. Yeah.
Yeah, both those things. Anything else? No. All right, cool. Favorite thoughts?
Yeah.
Everyone ready? That is great.
You good? Yep. Alright.
So how much has xenophobia increased since we started bringing in refugees?
We can't really quantify xenophobia, right? Like we're telling you that xenophobia
But
has
can you
increased
tell me
right now.
like a tangible impact of policy, right? Like,
Yeah.
Have you seen a policy
Sure.
shift?
Yeah, so basically we're telling you that because of xenophobia, once we tell the citizens that we should prioritize the refugees' lives over the citizens' lives, they don't want that, so that's why they're going to limit the amount of
just give me
refugee
like an
population.
empirical policy shift that's tangible.
An empirical policy shift?
Yeah.
Well, we can't really help give you that right now because
Wait, why?
because we aren't prioritizing humanitarian needs.
Wait, so
We
like,
aren't
countries like Germany are though, right? Like, have we seen a shift there?
Well, like Germany would be, Germany is like prioritizing national interest right now because they're doing it
I
for
would
the
disagree.
soft power.
No, I would disagree.
Why?
I would say the reason that Germany is like bringing in refugees
No.
is because like that's what the crisis assumes.
Well, no,
like if they get
Germany's-
the added wait, hold on. If they get the added benefit of soft power, like maybe that's a good thing.
Well, no.
But they're like Merkel has gone out on public saying like we have like as a world like the global responsibility to address this. I'm pretty sure like
Well,
their
no.
humanitarian
Here's the
needs is
thing,
what they're
right?
prioritizing.
Prioritizing
But, like,
depends on, right, like really quick, prioritizing depends on the intention of the action, right?
Right.
Okay, so Germany intends to gain soft power, and they intend by doing it by helping
If
the
Angela
refugees.
Merkel, the leader of Germany, comes out and says they're doing it for the humanitarian purpose, I think it's like kind of clear.
Well, are you going to ever say that I want to do this because I can get soft power? Like,
I
that's
mean-
not going to happen.
I mean, sure, like that might be the case, but like she might include like another line saying like Germany should like bolster its international reputation. They're simply not doing
Well,
that,
no,
right?
like they're not
the
going to say
reason-
that they want soft power, and that's why they're doing
I
that.
understand that, right? But like if you look to the actual action itself, they're not doing it because of the fact that like they want like there's like you say they're sacrificing their national interest in doing so. How? I mean, like you talk
What's
about
Germany
like,
doing?
You talk what?
How is Germany
I mean, like you
sacrificing?
guys talking about like opening up their borders specifically means that they're sacrificing like some sort of security harm.
Well,
that they
here's
might
the
get.
thing, right? Like in,
But,
like, in
hold on,
terms
just
of
give me an
national
example.
interest,
Like, because like that's the thing I'm looking for here, right? Like how much like,
I'll give you
xenophobia
an
have we
example of a country. If you give me an example of a country that prioritizes humanitarian needs, that since we've been going over this, can I have a question? So let's talk about like multilateralism, right?
Mhm.
How can a country prioritize humanitarian needs if it simply cannot? Like we
So
don't
like,
have.
but the important thing about multilateralism is that it helps countries that might not be able to do it right now do it.
How?
So specifically, what we play from MSJ is that right now a lot of countries can't actually contribute to the effort because they don't have the resources.
Yeah.
But when we contribute together as a global community, when each individual takes that step, then they're actually making sure that
Wait,
like
hold on.
even if they don't donate a ton of resources, they're at least donating some.
Wait, that doesn't really make any sense.
How?
Like because you're basically saying that you go from a country that has no resources to a country that has a little bit of resources.
I mean, like,
but
not
there's no
every country
transition
has
into
no
resources.
resources.
Huh?
But not every country has
Okay,
no
sure.
resources.
There's
And
like every
moreover-
country has
moreover-
resources, right? They don't have resources to
Right.
contribute to the crisis.
I mean, like, I'm not
acting
saying
in a
that they're gonna
multilateral
donate-
action
hold on.
doesn't really change that.
I mean, I'm not saying that every single country is going to give every single one of their resources, but moreover, like that's not even the question of the resolution, right? Like obviously countries that like couldn't even do it in the first place, like shouldn't be considered in the resolution, right? Because like there's no point, there's like no world in which that
So
occurs.
you're saying that the resolution only applies to governments that can actually do it?
I mean, like I would say that like in a world where like it doesn't occur, then like it's not necessarily
Well,
true.
no, like the resolution talks about governments generally, so you have to
Right.
prove that like
So, like-
generally all governments should be able to do it.
We're gonna take. Do you have that piece of evidence before I start?
Yeah, sure.
I won't start.
You have the 12% one.
Yeah.
And I'll show you the warrant about like less
Okay,
than
let's just wait till you get first. That's okay. Thank you.
Increase in refugees.
You said like from your second contention.
one unit is 12%.
Yeah, alright.
Okay, cool. So here's the warrant card for the pull factor, and here's the card 1% is 12%.
Here, can you read those?
So yeah, you just like said that.
Okay, we'll start.
So I'm asking for the card that says like they want to go back home.
They
They don't want to go back home.
after the
Gotcha.
privatization. Like, that's our warrant.
I'll do that.
What did you have?
52.
Seconds.
Are my opponents ready? All 3 managers. Until it's ready, go begin.
So starting off on framing a couple of things here, recognize that in today's world, our opponents are defending the deterioration of status quo. The UN High Commissioner came out last month and told you that refugees right now are prioritizing their national interests, and as such, they're making it harder for refugees to enter their country, they're cutting off aid to aid organizations, and refugees are dying at an alarming rate. The amount of refugees coming is outpacing the aid. So in today's debate, recognize that our opponents are defending the deterioration of status quo. Secondly, the biggest impact in today's round is human lives, because once a life is lost, you can never get it back. So that outweighs any economic benefit my opponent try to make in this round, or like a short-term violence benefits, right? So if we can prove to you that we save more lives on the pro, you should be affirming right there. Now onto my opponent's argument. First on social contract theory, a couple of responses. So first they tell you a primary responsibility is to its citizens, and while I agree that's true, Harvard from Nye tells you that in today's world we live in a global world where everyone is created equal and we're constantly cooperating with each other. Insofar as that's true, if I have the opportunity to save any human life, I should take it. Moreover, recognize the resolution talks about in the current crisis. So I agree as a whole, your primary obligation is to your citizens. But in today's debate, if my neighbor's house is burning down and I'm trying to decide whether I should splurge and eat eggs or eat Wheaties, then I should save my neighbor, because that's the bigger impact in today's round. They look to the current crisis, not just this general idea. Secondly, he talks about how no one will look to your citizens. That's a slippery slope fallacy that isn't going to occur. Just because I'm prioritizing refugees doesn't mean I'm going to completely start disregarding my citizens. That's not materializing. And finally, on feasibility, we're not advocating that every single time there's a refugee crisis, every government should go and act. But we're saying in the current crisis, the biggest refugee crisis we've seen in 15 years, governments should be acting, so this feasibility response that will always happen isn't materializing. Now on their second contention on brain drain, I have a couple of responses. So one, the biggest brain drain that's happening is the loss of lives, right? At the end of the day, if we're able to save lives, that's the biggest benefit to like refugees' economies and the economies of countries, right? Like these people aren't leaving a country, like their own evidence says these people are leaving countries for economic reasons, right? That's not what's happening in the current crisis. In the current crisis, people are leaving Syria because they're being persecuted and terrorized by their government here. They're having this warrant isn't really applicable. Moreover, on this idea of people not wanting to return, it has to do with economic migrants. It literally has nothing to do with refugees. Drop the argument. Moreover, when you want to look to economics, recognize that these refugees, according to the New York Times, even when they go to the best refugee camps, they still want to return home. So in the current crisis, repatriation is their desire. But secondly, according to the Norwegian Refugee Council, they find that they send remittances back to those countries. So when you affirm and allow more refugees to come, you benefit both the refugees because they have more jobs, and the people back in Syria because they send remittances back to benefit them. Now on their third contention where they talk about public backlash, I have a couple of responses. So first they need to quantify this, and Ozan explains to you why. Throughout the past 10 years, xenophobia in European countries has been increasing. They have to show me how much has the refugee crisis contributed to this increase, because if there's an upward trend, the refugee crisis might have no effect on it, it's just continuing happening. In fact, you should affirm today's resolution because it decreases xenophobia according to the UN National Administration Council. It tells you in surveys across Europe, with high refugee populations, you see lower levels of xenophobia than higher levels of xenophobia. That's really important because that means that right-wing populism isn't occurring. Moreover, recognizing other responsibles on tells you in Crossfire, they have to show you these policy decisions are being made. In fact, when you look to the policy decisions countries are actually making, they're making more and more policy decisions to help refugees, right? Like we cite the deal right at the bottom of our case between Germany and Turkey, allowing more refugees to come into their border, so these right-wing populist deals aren't occurring. And finally, the biggest response is, if we prioritize refugees, the Brookings Institute tells you that if we integrate them into our country, people see them as a boon rather than a bust, and moreover, they become citizens who are able to vote, so they fight back directly against this populism. It isn't occurring in the status quo. Affirming solves it and increases protection for refugees.
All right. Right.
used for
Students ready? Robert? And all three judges? Cool. Start. Let's start with an overview on this round. Remember, none of the substance in their case is specific to prioritization. They're saying, let's do good things for refugees, but they need to tell you, one, what is the threshold to prioritization? For example, we can still help refugees, but the main intent, first of all, has to be national interest, because bringing in refugees in certain ways can still benefit national interest, and two, they need to show some kind of trade-off, because if they don't, then we're prioritizing both, and everything they tell you is non-topical. Again, the resolution is not resolve we should do something nice for refugees, it's resolve we should prioritize. If they don't prove that, they lose. Even then, let's start with another overview of what's going on right now. The UN News Center writes that because the Syrian crisis is expanding, you can look to evidence from 2 days ago from Reuters that shows that now the EU has committed $70 million towards helping refugees, but they're not doing it for refugees' interests, they're doing it for national interests, because they're doing it to gain soft power and standing in the EU, especially because Angela Merkel says that if you don't do it, you're going to lose status in the EU. So for example, we can still do it while prioritizing national interests. They also need to tell you that the status quo getting worse is still happening, because if they don't do so, then there's no unique benefit to prioritization. Now let's move to their contention one about smuggling. The first response here is that when they tell you that they're being smuggled into the countries near Syria, that's because those are the countries near Syria. When you vote for the pro, the most probable form of prioritization happens in the developing countries that they say are so stretched because they're the ones that are most likely to accept refugees and can most easily accept refugees. That's problematic because The Economist writes that countries like Jordan and Lebanon are already stretched to the brink of chaos because they have to take these refugee flows, be it smuggled or not smuggled. The problem is refugees are pushing down wages for the people in Jordan, and in Lebanon they're taking away things from these terrorist and insurgent groups that have led to new forms of conflict. So if you vote for them, you're voting for greater instability. Moreover, the NYT explains that 86% of refugees either live in or are going to be living in developing countries. So if you vote for them, you're increasing the stress on those developing countries. They have to show a probability that developed countries go and get involved in areas that they are not. Then they tell you that smuggling is because of national interest, this Amnesty International evidence. First, this is outdated. We tell you that in the status quo, the EU is actually solving this. You can look to Market Watch explains that now the EU has even pledged to taking more refugees into their borders without affirming the resolution. So we can still go and solve for this, the problem they talk about without affirming the resolution. Then they tell you that it's going to decrease terrorism, and that's their first impact. Keep in mind, terrorism prevention is a national interest. You sign your ballot pro, they are telling you vote pro to benefit the national interest. The intent of the action is what determines priority. At that point, one, they're not prioritizing both. They're not prioritizing one, they're prioritizing both, or two, they're prioritizing negative world. Either way, you negate. And then they tell you that we can solve for the problem that refugees specifically face. But again, one, they're not showing you the need to prioritize, and two, and much more importantly, you can actually look to the Wall Street Journal, which explains that in the developing countries that end up having to help refugees, because they're going to get stretched through prioritization, there's a dollar-for-dollar trade-off between investing into refugees and investing into the poorest of the poor in those developing nations, which therefore A, harms the infrastructure in those countries that can support refugees, and B, harms the people in those countries, creating the same kind of suffering that refugees face. Don't vote for that, especially when the social contract is so important and we're proving a direct trade-off. Now go to contention 2 about international action, a lot of problems. 1, again, no uniqueness prioritization, make them prove that. 2, the resolution says a government. Sure, they can say a government is general, but when you affirm the resolution, the average one government chooses to do so. They have to prove that multilateral action happens in the affirmative world. It's improbable. Even then, Dallamay turns the argument. He explains that if one country prioritizes, it's going to send a strong message to all the other countries that we don't want to prioritize because of the backlash that we talk about in our case. We tell you that when people perceive a violation of the social contract, they stop supporting the kinds of policies that are doing that, and therefore other countries aren't going to prioritize humanitarian needs, taking out their offense. For that reason, future crises also can't be stopped if you vote for them. Then they tell you from Oxford that governments don't act in isolation. The problem here is that by their own logic, this is already happening, right? The EU just made these other countries get involved. Without prioritization, no reason to affirm. Then they tell you that collaboration is very effective. But again, we can still, when they talk about how we can minimize the harms by sharing the burden, that would be the opposite of prioritization, because that means governments are doing it to limit the harm on themselves instead of prioritizing to the fullest extent like they are right now, specifically in Jordan and Lebanon. That means that you're limiting the burden by sharing the interest, but that means less refugee protection on the whole. Finally, they say, let's solve the crisis, but Hawken explains that solving the crisis would be a national interest because it's international terror and Middle Eastern stability that are at risk, so that's a reason to negate.
At any point before my summary, can I see the fact that the EU deal you just talked about? The EU deal that you just talked about?
Yeah, sure.
And then can I see the violation of social contract makes other governments bad?
Yeah.
Full PDF.
I like cards with lots of context, but that's fine.
Okay, that might work.
Yeah. So this is just let's go to solve and so it's
Does it start to hold?
this is just it's expanding as a result. It's increased pressure. This is 2 days ago, or actually 3. I was reading from yesterday, so 2 days ago. You're incorrect. Correct. Very good.
And then can I see the violations of the social contract as the government's angry?
Okay, yeah, sure. So are you done with this?
Can I like keep this? I won't like look at
No,
it.
it's just up to you after the summary, before the summary. Then.
Yeah, sure. That works.
Let's do cross.
Okay.
Ready?
Well, ready? So, where have we seen right-wing populism increase
Yeah.
in policy decisions?
Alright, so Robert got it wrong in the first process. In Jordan, we tell you that right now we're cutting back on policies that bring refugees in. Sorry, Robert. Because of the fact that we've seen way too much prioritization. When the judge affirms the resolution, those kinds of countries are going to be stretched even more, trading off of the national interest leading to more populism, meaning less policies that benefit refugees. Do you have a question?
Okay, sure.
Alright, so we talk about smuggling. Why do we need to prioritize to solve the problem of smuggling?
Okay, specifically what we tell you, right? It is in the national interest and what countries have been doing to not let in refugees because there's a small amount of security without screening. By allowing legal channels for migration with less screening, it is against our national interest, but in prioritizing refugees, right there we should be
You just
prioritizing.
said we should do it to decrease terrorism threat to these countries, right?
Sure. Okay, so that's like
it's
all
not
the
like in the national interest to
no,
do it.
see, right? Like even if I prioritize refugees to further my national interest, you're still affirming today's resolution because if we can prove to you A causes B, like refugees
so-
cause national interest,
So
you still
let me give you an
affirm.
analogy, right? Like, I absolutely despise science. I go to science
Agreed.
class only to get into a good college, right? So my priority is getting into college. I still learn science in the class, but it's not my priority, right? My priority is what I want to achieve.
No,
If I
your
want to achieve
priority.
national
No,
interest,
no, no.
then
See,
you
that's what
get
you're
it.
misunderstanding. Your priority is the science class
No.
because yes, it is because you have to do good at that science class to get in the college.
No.
The
See,
science class is
so-
the necessary prerequisite. Can I ask you a question?
No, you can't, because
Okay.
I'm going to answer back with that, right? Like, what I'm saying here is that I'm going to science class, it's what I'm doing, sure. Like, you give aid, that's the thing you do. The priority is why you do it, right?
The priority is the prerequisite.
Like, by your logic, we could just do 1 second of humanitarian aid and then just move back to national interest and be like, we prioritize because we did
I
aid
agree. I
first.
say nothing about time frame.
No,
I'm
I
saying
know.
all we can do is if we show you one causes the other, that's an affirmative ballot. Can I please ask you a
I
question?
disagree. Go ahead.
Okay, so in your in your first contention about the social contract theory, right? Like, so don't you agree we should modify that in light of one of the greatest refugee crises in history?
I think we should help refugees. I don't think we should affirm the resolution because it undermines the system that allows governments to function, right? If governments can say someone's more important than my own people, that justifies an infinite precedent
But that's
where
not
every
what
time
they're
there's a
saying.
problem,
That's,
we just
okay,
step
you're
in with their people.
misunderstanding it though.
Yeah.
It's not like a government saying the refugees in Syria are more important than my own people. It's
No.
saying that the refugees in Syria are in such a dire situation, I have to go help them.
Then you're not affirming the resolution, right? Prioritization inherently means one thing over the other. It's not just one thing. So yes,
Right,
refugees
we're
are in
going
a
to
dire
help them.
situation, as Angela Merkel would say, but she would never say this is not for soft power and that it might harm our
Okay,
people.
also,
but whatever.
on that argument, like, you have no evidence to say that. You're literally just asserting they're doing this for soft power. Like, you give me no evidence in any,
Like my evidence literally says that like Angela Merkel told these countries to do it because otherwise they lose status in the EU. Like that's a national
Okay, well,
interest. They
that
want
kind
to
of
do it.
contradicts what Robert said when he says Angela Merkel would never say that in the first crossfire.
No, like she like for her own country because like.
Right, but Robert says he would never say that
like
because
the
she would
other
never
coun-
talk about
the other
extending
countries.
soft power.
Okay, like please.
So if anything, like, you're
So now can
contradicting
I answer your
yourself.
question?
Sure.
Or, yeah, the other countries that weren't getting involved are now doing so for national interest, and she had to make it clear to get that done.
Okay, is it okay with you if I like keep this so I can read your summary?
Keep what?
The computer.
If I could write down the quote, that'd be better. But if
Okay, sure, that works. Can I get that evidence now? The social contract is the
Yeah,
violation.
less policies. Gotcha.
And then we will take track.
Yeah. Right. Okay, so we have like 4 different cards on it. Do you want the one about like other countries, or do you want the one about the host country?
Other countries,
Okay.
It's like the one you cite in case.
I
the
said
one, the one that
four
you use,
cases,
the
and then I
one
said
you
one
respond in, like in response to our.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Just keep it. So it says unilateral decisions would make other countries do the same thing.
So we're going to start
Against refugees.
We'll stop for that. Actually, we'll continue from this.
Yep.
We got 40 seconds. So, I'm going to make some overviews, and then I'm going to talk about their case, and then why you go for us. Okay, is everybody ready? Great. Starting off, remember what Amar tells you in his rebuttal, which isn't responded to. There's a deterioration of the status quo. The situation is only getting worse according to the UN High Commission on Refugees. They try to respond to this piece of evidence. It's from 2014. Our Antonio Gutierrez evidence, the High Commissioner of Refugees, is from like October of this year, takes precedent. Here's why that's important, because what they again didn't respond to is what Amar tells you in rebuttal, that lives are most important. It doesn't matter if like this brain drain or whatever occurs, I can't use my brain if I'm dead. Lives are irreversible, that's what you should look to. Here's the reason why it's important, because negating today's resolution means that you continue the status quo, you continue prioritization of national interest, which means that more refugees die. Affirming means you get a risk at solvency and actually saving human lives. You can affirm in today's debate right there. But more importantly, when they talk about like, the status quo and how like national interest solves, look to their evidence, call for it. It talks about the guy literally discussed the needs of refugees when giving more aid. It says nothing about national interest. Right there, you cannot like negate. Then go to the thing about social contract theory. First of all, social contract theory doesn't mean like prioritize, it just means protect. There's no like sacrificing of the like this social contract theory, because we're not like saying that we like not gonna protect our citizens, we're just gonna say we're not prioritizing them. There's no violation there. But on this point about this entire thing about how public backlash, their evidence has nothing to do with the social contract theory and how that's somehow gonna spill over to other countries or even in the host countries. Don't look at the argument. But moreover, on xenophobia, it decreases in the affirmative world. Make them respond to what Omar tells you in his rebuttal, that when you actually get associated with the refugee people, when you affirm, when you let more people in, xenophobia goes down empirically across Europe. That's the reason to vote Africa there, because we see decreased bad policy, we see increased good policy. Then, go to the first contention about smuggling. They totally misinterpret the argument. We're not saying that they're going to developing countries, we're saying that when you prioritize humanitarian needs of refugees, according to Francois Crepeau, which is completely unresponded to, you open up safe and legal channels for migration. That's important, because what they again to respond to is Dijon, who said that developed countries, when they do this, they'll be able to eliminate smuggling completely. That's important, because then go to our impact on 70% of refugees dying. At the end of the day, we prevent 70% of refugee deaths. That's the most biggest impact on the lives in the round when it comes to lives, so you can affirm right there. And then moreover, on this entire idea, they never respond to the fact that it's not prioritization when it comes to burden sharing, it's just governments coming together to work.
Alright. Oh, by the way, you guys said like the evidence, you didn't get the evidence about the social contract. Did you want that evidence? Because it was like two different.
Wait, isn't that what you showed me?
No, that was the one about just like spilling over to other countries. You wanted the one about like cutting policies in their country because of social contract. I offered that to you and then you didn't take
Yeah,
it.
it's fine. Okay, it's fine.
Alright, it's fine.
I got that's all your credit.
Alright.
Alright, so the order is going to be a quick overview. Their voters are voters. So that being said, everyone ready? Alright. Start out with the overview. This is actually the first reason why you win, because they never show you the unique benefits of prioritization. We are already helping refugees without prioritizing the humanitarian needs. For example, the vet tells you that the EU has already given $66 million to refugees, but they did it because of soft power. The intention was never for humanitarian needs. If you want these benefits to keep going on, you have to go for the con. With that being said, go on to their case. First of all, they talk about smuggling. Two responses. First of all, again, you don't have to prioritize humanitarian needs to solve this. But second of all, remember again that in the status quo, the European Union already wants to take in more refugees. That's going to solve all this smuggling issue. You don't have to prioritize humanitarian needs. But then going to the second argument about multilateralism, there's three main responses. First of all, again, you don't have to prioritize. Second of all, if one country prioritizes, this is actually going to be bad because this just shows other countries that there's a xenophobic effect and they should not help refugees in the future. But third and most importantly, remember that they want to have this argument because it limits the burden on one specific country. That's going to be a national interest. They're not advocating this because of humanitarian needs. With that being said, go on to our case. First of all, we talk about the social contract. They said that everyone is created equal, but the thing is, if a government has a choice to save a life between their own country and another country, obviously they're going to be choosing the one to save the life that's in their country. At that point, you have to realize that the social contract is extremely important. But then go on to complacency. This is going to be the main reason why you vote for us. First of all, they tell you that xenophobia declines, whereas the vote for refugees increases. The economic balance that the public is extremely uncommitted to keeping foreign aid programs afloat economically when they understand a cost to their own interests. This support is enumerated at 0.4%. It empirically verifies that humanitarian aid is the first on the chopping block, and when this disenfranchisement increases. But second, they say that integration solves. Integration is good, but when you're infirm, you push developing countries like Jordan past the breaking point, where now you see strict policies towards refugees as a result. At that point, you're going to be extending three cards. The first is God, who tells you that we are less inclined to help if we are xenophobic. The second is Hajnal. He impacts this for you, saying that this is going to lead to conservative policy making. We don't want to help refugees in the future. And finally, look at Delmar. He says that there's a spillover effect. Other countries do not want to help refugees if they realize that the xenophobic effect occurs in one country. And for these reasons, I strongly urge to vote con.
Okay. Alright. So let's talk about xenophobia. Does everyone ready, first of all? Yeah? Okay, great. Let's talk about xenophobia.
Yeah.
So, your evidence that talks about how they've started scapegoating refugees. What does it say about when that started?
I don't know. I didn't hand
It
you that
says,
evidence. The
no,
one
no,
specific
in
to Jordan-
case you read it.
That
Right?
was the evidence I handed you. The one specific
No,
to
no,
Jordan.
sorry. In case you read this came out from
Yeah.
China. It says it predates the actual refugee crisis.
No,
right?
no. What the evidence says is that when refugees pushed to the brink of the brink point, what happened is they started blaming refugees for problems that
Right.
predated the crisis.
Okay, wait.
That's what we
so,
mean.
here's my question then, right? If Amar tells you it's been on the rise and that affirming solves for it, then how do you accidentally agree with that?
I mean, first of all, we would argue that as of 2 days ago, which you never responded to, you just claimed it was
So I did.
2014, even though it wasn't, right? It is from 2 days ago. 3
No,
days,
no, no,
sorry.
I'm not.
It
So
says-
here's the thing, right? Your evidence that says the status quo is improving is from last year. I'm saying right now,
Wait, no.
in 2015,
It
let me
definitely
finish. In 2015, the status quo is deteriorating according to the UN Commission architects. But the evidence that you talk about, the 66 million, is totally has nothing
Okay,
to do.
so-
It's not. Wait, hold on. Let me finish. Not a single place in the card does it talk about national interest. One. Two, the part that you don't make in the
Alright,
big
can I
font
actually,
says
answer
that
what
they're
you're saying?
actually looking to the needs of refugees.
You're just making a bunch of attacks, right? First of
I'm
all,
not
it
making
is.
attacks, I'm talking about the
let me
fact
answer,
that you're
right?
misinterpreting
The evidence is from
evidence.
November 4th, 2015, first of all. Second of
I'm
all,
not doubting that.
second of all, it says they're doing it for the worsening security situation and the pressure from the European Union. Those are both national
situation
issues.
where?
In the,
In Syria.
What do you mean? The worsening
Worsening
security
security
situation
situation
in
where?
Europe because of the problems you talked about, like smuggling, where they get smuggled
Okay,
to
so
Europe.
if I call for the full context of that part, it's going to talk about the worsening security situation in Europe.
The full context.
If I ask for the full PDF, it's not going to talk about the fact that, like we tell you from the UN High Commissioner, the security situation is deteriorating in Syria.
I don't know. It talks about the European Union specific situation, so you can look at the evidence.
Sure.
Can I have a
You guys
question?
have a question for us now.
Alright, so you keep saying lives are really important, and I agree, right? At the end of the day, how do you save those lives? Is it
So-
through humanitarian assistance?
So no, so we specifically tell you, and you don't respond to this,
Yeah.
that Francois proposed this, when you put the lives of refugees at the forefront,
Yeah.
what that means is you open up safe and legal paths for migration into developed or developing countries.
No.
again,
I understand what you're arguing for. So at the very root, you're
So,
advocating that
the
when we
root
try to
of-
assist refugees, their lives are saved. Pretty
Right.
clean,
So,
right?
the
Yes or
smuggling,
no?
so here's the thing.
Yeah,
The
okay.
International Organization of Migration tells you that smuggling is responsible for 70% of the deaths
I
of
don't need the
refugees.
citations. I'm just asking you at the very root. Trying to help refugees is how we save their lives. Yes or no?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
if we decrease motivation to help refugees through an affirmative ballot, do we link into lives?
Okay,
Never prove this.
yeah, that's
we
the
link
problem.
into
No, you
life if we
continually
do?
tell me that like right-wing populism is increasing. I tell you that it's been on the rise, and ever since we
No.
accepted refugees, it's gone down.
No, like,
You've never responded to
We
that,
actually
and it
just
kind
did,
of
right?
looks
The card that you read just said that like populism is going down.
You never
but the
asked for the
econ-
card.
asked for the
How could you
card.
have like know
Like,
what it's
that
saying?
because we read the Economist evidence from this year, which says that
That's
whereas
not
that's
from The Economist.
wait, no, like our own evidence, right?
Okay, sure.
Which says that whereas that is true, when people actually talk about specifically aid and factor in the cost of their own country, support is now at 0.4%. It is the first thing on the chopping block when you affirm.
Wait,
She just read that.
that's not. Actually, can I see the context of that
No,
card?
it's fine. It's fine.
Okay, never mind. We're good.
So we have 40, 20, like we have 26 seconds, so we're gonna run the episode. Punch, you guys ready? All three of my judges? And Ozan's always ready? All we can. Starting off on framework, our opponents have already lost this round. They concede to the idea that lives are most important, but then they never respond to what Ozan tells you cleanly extensive summary that the UN High Commissioner says when countries are left to prioritize their national interests, more people are dying, less aid is given, and countries are restricting their borders. Insofar as that's true, you should affirm just based on the idea that maybe you solve it, maybe you save lives, because in the negative world you just allow more people to die. Then my opponents try to generate offense in two ways, but it's not really working for them. The first is the social contract theory, right? Recognize they're completely unresponsive to what I tell you, that the refugee crisis is dire, and the situations in the country they're talking about, people aren't dying, right? They say I should save my citizen's life over a refugee's life, but I'm showing you millions of refugees are dying, and throughout this whole debate, they haven't shown me a single citizen who's dying, so obviously you should save the refugee. Then secondly, they try to gain offense by talking about how like the national interest is soft power, so they're doing it for soft power, but then they don't respond to the analysis that if A causes B, then you prioritize A because that leads to it. That's the more important thing, because without prioritizing refugees' needs, you're never going to get to that national interest, so the refugees' needs is more important because it's necessity. Then you can turn their argument and vote for us on xenophobia right there. They're completely unresponsive to the evidence throughout today's round that when you increase refugee flows, you see xenophobia go down. Their main warrant for all these harms to refugee policies and like refugee policies that are on the chopping block are because of increases in xenophobia. We proved to you in today's debate that if you vote for an affirmative ballot, you allow xenophobia to decrease. Insofar as that's true, you vote for us right there because that shows that you're helping more refugees in the long term. But the second place you can vote for us is on smuggling. So his only response to smuggling is the idea that like it's going to developing countries, but we tell you it's from the EU. Insofar as that's true, by decreasing smuggling, which you can only do in the pro-world because it's in the national interest to turn a blind eye to smuggling because it takes resources, it takes effort, you save 70% of refugees that die. That is the biggest impact in today's debate because it quantifies the most number of lives. For all these reasons, I see no other ballot than one of pros.
As a brief off-time roadmap, I'm going to write your ballot for you. Everyone ready? All right. Start with the overview. Remember, prioritization comes first. That's what the resolution is about, and there are two ways they're losing here. First is that they don't prove the bright line to prioritization. They extend this qualitative evidence saying that when we prioritize national interests, refugees suffer. That is not true. We told you 2 days ago, $66 million, and we tell you that it's happening because of pressure from the EU. So even if you don't buy the first justification, at the very least, they're doing it for both interests, not just one. It means there's no prioritization that's happening. If they don't tell you why we have to prioritize, they are not affirming the resolution, you drop them on face. And second, more importantly, they don't show you the benefit of prioritization, right? If the status quo is solving, what we tell you is that when you prioritize, countries, specifically developing countries who are near these refugees, have to get pushed past what they can do, which leads to the harms that we get triggered in our case. Also, we tell you that the developing countries make up 86% of surrounding these nations, so the harms will definitely go there. And we prove to you that there's a dollar-for-dollar trade-off with benefiting the people in those countries and the refugees. That means that it links hard into the social contract argument, which is the first voter issue. We tell you that the governments have to prioritize their own people. They say we're not harming our people, but we are, right? We tell you in Jordan they had to take the refugees, and as a result, now we're seeing harms Now they're on the brink of chaos, the economy is struggling, and we have to pass anti-refugee policies going forward. They say, well, we should just share the burden. But sharing the burden is not prioritization because that means we're trying to maximize national interest. That's not a reason to affirm, but even then, there's no probability they don't extend any of it, you can't vote for it. Then, let's go into their voter issue where they talk about lies, and they're losing here as well for a few reasons. One is that we beat this back in cross when we tell you that the prerequisite to lies is motivation for policy. We kill motivation for policy, you negate. Even then we tell you that this kind of action doesn't happen because the paths to get to Europe are not as strong as the paths to get to developing countries, which is why when you affirm developing countries again take the burden, leading to the dollar for dollar trade-off, leading to the harms that make you sign your ballot con. And then the final voter issue is policies. They say, well, xenophobia goes down. Robert puts the response in summary. He tells you from The Economist that even if xenophobia is going down, support for the policies goes down to 0.4% when people factor in the cost to their own nations. That's why we tell you affirm, and aid is on the chopping block. That decreases it in the long term. We also tell you this is specific to the resolution because prioritization creates the stigma where government says refugees are more important than my own people, and as a result, no policies happen in future crises and this crisis, and that's what you negate.